Perl programming language. In this nugget, we're going to talk about a very flexible and powerful programming language called Perl. We're going to go through some sample programs and compare and contrast those programs to shell scripts that we've already written. So let's get to work. Well, let's start our discussion of Perl by just talking a little bit about what it's good for. Certainly the kinds of things that we've done so far with shell scripts, we could also have written a Perl script to accomplish the same task. But Perl is good for much more than that. Perl is phenomenal at text processing. Okay, this was the first reason I used Perl, was because I had this scientific simulation program and it created these huge output data files. Okay, then I wrote some Perl scripts to go through those output data files, which were just text, and go through there and create some statistics, do some reports, things like that, do some statistical analysis on the data file, and that just ended up saving me a lot of time as opposed to going through it by hand, which would have been practically impossible. Perl would be good for processing your log files. Okay, so if you want to go through your web server logs, for instance, and create some reports and talk about how many times the web server's been accessed, or what IP addresses are accessing the web server, what kind of error messages or warning messages are showing up on the web server, Perl would be a good choice to write a script to go through your log files. Perl is good for the common gateway interface applications that you see out on the internet. And that's probably part of the reason for the resurgence of Perl in the last 10 years, is that so many CGI applications are written in Perl, and that sparked the interest of a lot of people to learn Perl. But Perl's good for all sorts of other network programming too. You can access sockets and do low-level network programming. You can write FTP clients or email servers or whatever. You can do all that in Perl. So Perl itself is a very basic language, but it has all these modules that you can sort of just like plug in, and then Perl gets all this extra added functionality to accomplish some specific task like network programming or a CGI application and so on. Okay, so what I'm trying to do in this nugget is just whet your appetite for Perl, give you a little bit of an exposure to what Perl is, the kinds of things it can do. I'm going to give you some pointers on where you can learn more about Perl, and hopefully after all of this you'll have an idea of what Perl can accomplish. You'll be able to read some simple Perl scripts and also write some simple Perl scripts, and you'll also know where to get more information if you need to write a more complicated script. Alright, so let's move out to the Linux screen and start writing some Perl scripts. Alright, well here we've got an Emacs window open. I've got this file called test1.pl. So Perl scripts end with the .pl extension, and having the .pl extension on a file puts Emacs into Perl mode. And Perl mode is like the bash shell scripting mode. It just highlights variables one color and strings another color and commands another color and so on. Okay, so the first thing to notice about this Perl program are these first two lines. The first line again starts out with that shebang, that sharp sign followed by the exclamation mark. But instead of putting the path to the shell, you're putting a path to the Perl interpreter, /user/bin/Perl. Okay, now the next line here is a comment, and this looks exactly like a comment in the bash shell scripting language. As soon as we put a sharp sign on the line, the rest of the line is a comment, except for that first line that starts with sharp exclamation mark. Okay, now the rest of this program is it's a pretty simple program, and all I'm trying to show in this program is how Perl handles numbers and strings. Okay, so the basic variable type in Perl is called a scalar, and a scalar can either be a number or it can be a string. And we already learned what strings were back in the last nugget. A string is just a series of characters and digits and things like that. Okay, so here what I've done is I've set up this variable called variable1, and I've set it equal to 5. Then I've set up this variable called variable2, and I've set it equal to the string 10. Okay, notice 10 is in quotes here, and it's the string 1 followed by 0. Okay, then there's variable 3, which is the string perfect. Okay, now what I can do is I can say variable 4 equals variable 1 plus variable 2. Okay, variable 1 is the number 5, and variable 2 is the string 10. But Perl doesn't care so much about that. Perl will do the conversion of the string 10 into the number 10, and then it'll let us do this arithmetic, store 5 plus 10, which is equal to 15, store that 15 into variable 4. Okay, and then the way to print out stuff in Perl is to use the command print, and then you follow that by a quoted string, just like we did in the bash shell scripting language. We would here what we're saying is the fourth variable is equal to $variable4. This /n here says add a new line character, or like a carriage return, so that the next print statement doesn't show up on the same line. It'll show up on the next line down. Okay, so here it should say the fourth variable is equal to 15, because that's what 5 plus 10 is equal to. Okay? Notice one thing here about assigning variables and using variables is that in Perl, you always precede the variable by a $sign. Okay? In the Bash shell scripting language, if you were just setting a variable equal to 5 or something, you didn't need the $sign on the left-hand side. Okay? But you always need that $sign in Perl, whether the variable's on the left-hand side of an equation or the right-hand side. Okay? Now let's look at this line. This says variable 5 is equal to variable 3 period variable 2. Okay, so that period there, or the dot, is what's called the concatenation operator. So that sticks two strings together. So you use the concatenation operator on strings, and that will sort of blend the two strings into one string. Okay, so here variable 3 is perfect, variable 2 is 10, and so variable 5 would equal perfect 10. Okay, so when it prints out the fifth variable is equal to $variable 5, it'll go get the value of variable 5, substitute that into the print statement, so it'll say the fifth variable is equal to perfect 10. Okay, now let's just go out to the screen and run this program, go out to the command line and run this program, and we can run this program either by typing Perl test1.pl, and there's the answer that we expect. Fourth variable is equal to 15, fifth variable is equal to perfect 10. Notice there's no spaces in there, just concatenated those two strings together, just butt up right against each other. Okay. You can also run a Perl script the same way you ran Bash shell scripts. You can just say test1.pl, and as long as you've made the script executable, then it will run in this fashion as well. Okay, so again, we get the exact same output because we haven't changed anything, and this is exactly what we were expecting. Okay, so Perl will do a conversion from a string to a number or a number to a string if it needs to make sense of things. What you couldn't do in Perl is add like perfect to 5. Okay, well, if it converts perfect to a number, what number would that be equal to? I have no idea, right? So you can't say here variable 4 equals variable 1 plus variable 3. Okay, Perl would sort of choke on that. What it would end up doing is just assigning variable 1 to variable 4. It would just assume that perfect is equal to 0 or something. Okay, so you have to be careful because Perl will do a lot of conversion for you. Just make sure that it's doing the kinds of conversions that you're expecting it to do. All right, so that's our first Perl script. Now let's look at one that's slightly more complicated. Okay, well here's our second Perl script. It's called test2.pl, and in this Perl script we're doing something very similar to what we did in a shell script in the last nugget. Okay, we're going to go through the users on the system and look for the users that have an identification number between 500 and 1,000. But instead of just counting up the users that are normal users on the system, because what we did in the shell script was we just said there's like 4 normal users on your system, something like that. Okay, well what we're going to do now is instead of just saying there's 4 normal users on your system, we're going to print out the names of the users that are normal users. So we're going to print out like Perry, Annie, Chuck, Dennis, that sort of thing, okay, which are the normal users on our system that we added back in that user administration nugget. Okay, so to accomplish this, we use a special variable in Perl called an array, and we start arrays with the @ sign. So the @ sign there says this is an array of names. This is an array of IDs. Okay, so let's move out to the whiteboard just to talk about arrays a little bit and just kind of get an idea of what they are and how they're structured. Then we're going to come back and interpret exactly what this program's doing, and you can see how to use arrays in an actual Perl script. Okay, so what is an array in Perl? Well, an array is a collection of objects, or a list of objects in some sense. Okay, and the way that you can assign a set of objects to a particular array is you can say @names equals, then you do these curly braces, which are right over the square brackets on the keyboard, and then inside of those curly braces you can make a whole list. Larry, comma, Mo, comma, curly, and this list can be as long or as short as you want. Okay, now what this does is it assigns Larry to the array names, it assigns Mo to the array, and it assigns Curly to the array. Okay, so this is how you would assign these values to this array names in Perl. Okay, but pictorially I like to think about it like this. Okay, that names is the name of this box. Okay, and then it's got indexes, index 0, index 1, index 2. In the 0 box is the first name Larry, in the 1 box is the name Mo, and in the 2 box is the name Curly, because that's the order they were given in this assignment statement. Okay, so this is the way I like to think about it pictorially. And then if I want to print out Mo, for instance, well, what I can do is I can say print, and then I can say $ names square brackets 1. Okay, so now this prints out a particular element, a particular scalar value in this array names. It's going to print out the thing at index 1, and from our picture you can see index 1 is mo. So the result of this print statement, it will print out mo to the screen. Okay, so there's the basic idea of how arrays work. Now let's move back out to the Linux screen and see arrays in action. Alright, so now let's go through this Perl script, test2.pl, carefully now that we understand a little bit more about arrays. Okay, so the way that we saw back on the whiteboard to give values to an array, I'm just going to type it in here so that we can compare it. We said something like @names equals parentheses Larry, Mo, and curly. Okay, then we did square curly braces, semicolon. And this put Larry into names at index 0, this put Mo into the array names at index 1, and this put curly into the array names at index 2. Okay, well, we're not going to do things like that in this particular example. What we're doing in this example is we're putting the values into the names array via a command, okay, via a shell command. Now here you can see I'm using backticks, and the backticks here mean the exact same thing as backticks meant in shell scripting. We're going to run a command inside of the backticks, and then the output of that command is going to go into the variable on the left-hand side of this assignment statement. Okay, so what's going into this variable names? Well, what we're doing is we're printing out the password file, then we're cutting out the first field of the password file using colon as the delimiter. Okay, so we did almost this exact same command a few times now already in different shell scripts, both in the last nugget and in the introductory videos. And what this does is it pulls out the first field of the Etsy password file, which are the usernames. Okay, so it's going to take the first username and put that in the array names at index 0, and that username happens to be root. Okay, so a names array at index 0 is going to hold the username root. Okay, then the names array at index 1 is going to have the next name in the Etsy password file, which I don't know off the top of my head. Let's just say it's called the FTP user. Okay, so FTP is in the names array at index 1, and so on. Okay, good. Now, the IDs array, that array is going to be filled with values, and that's going to be filled with values in almost the exact same way. We're going to print out the password file, but now we're going to cut out the third field using colon as the delimiter. Okay, the third field of the Etsy password file is the identification numbers. Okay, so here what we're doing is we're saying at IDs, the array IDs at index 0 is going to be the identification number of the first user in Etsy password. Okay, now notice the correlation between these two arrays. The names array at index, say, like 13, okay, is going to hold some username. Well, what's in the IDs array at index 13? Well, it's going to be the identification number of the name at index 13 in the names array. Okay, so these two arrays are what we call like parallel arrays, or like, you know, they're like a team. Okay, they both hold data from the password file, and unless the password file changed miraculously in between when we ran these two commands, they're going to be, you know, they're going to team up here. And the names array at index 10 and the IDs array at index 10 are going to be values for the exact same user on the system, the name of that user and the identification number of that user. Okay, good. So now we understand how the names array and the IDs array are filled with values. Now what we do is we say length here, $length, is equal to @IDs. Well, what is this @IDs? @IDs is an array. It's an array. It holds a whole bunch of elements. Okay, holds all the different identification numbers for all the users on the system. How can we assign that to a scalar variable like length, which is supposed to hold numbers or strings? Well, what happens in Perl when you say $length is equal to some array? What gets stored in $length is the number of items in that array. Okay, or the length of the array is the way I like to think of it. So if there's like 25 identification numbers in the IDs array, then $length here will be equal to 25. Okay, then we use $I here, and we start at equal to 0, and it's just going to serve as a counter, or it's going to help us index the elements of the two arrays here. Okay, so that's the preliminaries for this particular program. Then what we do is we just issue this print statement. We say the normal users on your system are, and then we put in this new line character, and then we're going to execute this while loop to actually print out all the names of the normal users on the system. Okay, so let's look at this while loop first just at the outer level. So at the outer level, what we're saying here is while $i is less than length. Now we should be able to read this since we've already read while loops in the shell scripting language. The syntax is not exactly the same. Okay, we use the less than sign instead of saying like minus LT. Okay, there's no like do associated with the while, and there's no done associated with the while. Okay, what we do to signify the beginning of the while loop is we use one curly brace, then we use another curly brace down here to signify the end of the while loop. Okay, so it's a little bit more terse, if you will, in Perl because there's not as many words and things like that, but it gets just as easy to read once you've read a few Perl programs. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're saying while I is less than length, do all the stuff in between those two curly braces. Okay. Notice here, so that's what's going to happen. At the beginning, I is equal to 0 and length is equal to the the number of elements in this array. And so I is equal to 0, length is equal to say 30 or something like that. So this is true. Okay, so since it's true the first time, then we're going to go in and execute all this code in between the two curly braces. Now, what is the code that's getting executed between these two curly braces? Let's explain that carefully. Okay. Now inside of here, this if statement that's inside of here is just like we saw with if statements in the bash shell scripting language. We're going to test some condition here, and if this condition is true, then we'll do the stuff in between this curly brace and this curly brace. Okay, so again, the syntax is a little different. There's no like phi here to signify the end of the if statement. You don't have to use the word then with the if statement. Okay, so again, Perl is a little bit more economical in its syntax than the bash shell scripting language was. Okay, so now what's going on inside of this if statement? Let's make sense of that. Okay, remember that $i here is equal to 0 the first time through the loop. So what we're saying is look at the 0 index of the IDs array. Okay, and determine if it's greater than or equal to 500. So the way we do greater than or equal in Perl is we just say greater than equal sort of bunched up against each other. Okay, and that's like minus GE in the bash shell scripting language. Okay, so is the 0 index of the IDs array greater than or equal to 500? Okay, that's the first test we do right there. Okay, then we say and is the 0th index of the IDs array also less than or equal to 1,000. So the way we did and in the bash shell scripting was we said minus a to signify that logical and, but in Perl we use double ampersands. Okay, so is the 0 index of the IDs array greater than or equal to 500, and is the 0 index of the IDs array less than or equal to 1,000? So if both of these are true, okay, then what we're going to do is we're going to print out the 0th index of the names array. Okay, so if we find an ID that's between 500 and 1,000, we're going to print out its teammate, okay, the partner of it in the names array. Because what we're doing in this program is we're printing out the normal users on your system are. We're not printing out their identification numbers, we're actually printing out their names. Okay, and the way that we're going to do that is every time we find an identification number between 500 and 1,000, we're going to print out its teammate or the same element in the names array. Okay, once we're done with this if statement, then we take the variable I and we add 1 to it. So then we check the first index of each of these arrays. And then we check the second index and the third index and the fourth index until we reach the very end. Okay, until we get up to the length of the particular array. Okay, so if there's 25 things in here, we're going to do this loop 25 times. Okay, and each time through the loop, we're going to check a particular element of the IDs array, determine if it's between 500 and 1,000. If it is, then we're going to print out its corresponding name. Okay, and that's all we do here. That's the extent of the program, and it should be pretty easy to understand what's going on in here since we did pretty much the same thing in bash shell scripting. We're just learning some of the differences in syntax with Perl. Okay, I just want to look at one more Perl program now that's going to introduce a couple more new concepts, and it's going to build heavily upon this Perl script called test2.pl that we just went through in great detail. Okay, so the new Perl script is called spacecheck.pl, and I'm going to switch over to that buffer in Emacs. Okay, I've already written this program. Here's the full program. It fits all on this screen. Okay. First, let's talk about what this program does in general terms, and then we'll go through it carefully and make sure we understand exactly what it does in detail. Okay, so in general terms, this program checks the disk usage for every normal user on the system and prints out the list of those that are over the limit. Okay, so conceptually this makes sense. It's going to go through and look at all the normal users on the system and look at how much space they're using. If the amount of disk space they're using is over the limit, then it's going to print out a little message saying, you know, Perry is over the limit, for instance. Okay, what's the limit? Well, the limit is just a variable that I've defined in here. I've set limit equal to 5,000. So every time I find a user that's using more than 5,000 kilobytes of disk space, then you know, I print out a message to the screen. Okay, good. These 4 lines of code are identical to what we did in the last program. We have a names array, we have an IDs array, we're putting the same information in those 2 arrays. We have this length variable, that's going to hold the number of elements in the IDs array again, and we have this I variable to help us walk through and look at the individual elements of these arrays, and again we're starting that at 0 since all arrays start at index 0. Okay, so we're already up to here in this program. These 2 lines are new. Okay, what these 2 lines do are just the chomp command takes off new line characters off of the ends of words. Okay, the only reason that we're doing this is because it makes the output look pretty. If ever you're writing a Perl script and you're doing some print statements and everything's not quite lining up, things look a little bit wonky, try chomping some variables that are causing the problems. And chomp is going to take off new line characters if they're there, and that's going to help make your output look pretty. Okay, this while loop is basically identical to the while loop in test2.pl. The condition at the top is the same, while I is less than length. So we're going to go through this loop, we're going to walk through this loop the same number of times as we have elements in the IDs array. Okay, just like in the last program. The if statement is identical to the last program. What's different is that what we do inside of the if statement. Instead of printing out names of I, like we did before, $name, square bracket, $I, but we did a print statement there. Now what we're doing is we're calling a subroutine called find disk usage. Okay, so we're calling a subroutine, we're saying find disk usage for this name that I just found who had an ID number between 500 and 1,000. The way that we call a subroutine is we start out with an ampersand, then we give the name of the subroutine, and then we give the arguments or the parameters to the subroutine inside of the parentheses. Giving a parameter to a subroutine is just like giving parameters or arguments to a shell script like we saw in the last nugget. Okay, and the nugget we saw it back even in the introductory videos. We gave arguments to a shell script right on the command line, and the same kind of thing is happening here. This subroutine is taking an argument, and the argument is the name of the user that has an ID number between 500 and 1,000. We're going to call this subroutine every time we find an identification number between 500 and 1,000, and we're going to pass the subroutine the name of that user. We say we're passing the subroutine the name, which means we're just giving the subroutine this particular piece of input, and we're letting it operate on that input. Okay, so otherwise this while loop is the same besides this line. The if statement's the same. We increment I down at the bottom. We go back up to the top when after I's been incremented, and we go through the loop over and over and over again. The only difference is we call this subroutine every time we find a user that has an identification number between 500 and 1,000. So let's look at what this subroutine does. Okay, here's the subroutine. Well, the way that I write a subroutine in Perl is I say sub followed by the subroutine name, okay, and then I just write code inside the subroutine like I would write code anywhere else in a Perl script. The only thing special about a subroutine code is you have a special variable here called $_. This is an array variable, $_, and what it is, it's an array of the arguments that are passed to it. So you don't have to pass just one thing to a subroutine. You could pass 20 things to a subroutine. The first thing then in that list would be $_0. The next thing in the list would be $_1, $_2 would be next, and so on. Since we only passed one thing to the subroutine at a time, we only have one argument, and that argument is known as $_0. Okay, so what I'm doing then is I'm issuing this command, which we saw back in the introductory videos. We wrote a script sort of similar to this, but it didn't go through the password file. It just took names from the command line that the user typed in and looked at the disk usage for all those names. Okay, well, what we're doing now is we're doing that exact same command. Notice again the backticks. So the output of this command is going to be put into this variable called usage. So we're doing a du command which checks disk usage. Minus s says the summary. And what is it checking the disk usage of? Well, it's checking disk usage starting at the /home $$_0 directory. What's $$_0? It's the name that we passed into this subroutine that had an identification number between 500 and 1,000. Okay, so we're checking the disk usage for a normal user. We're also doing the cut command here because the output of the du command is a little bit more than just the name or just the size, the amount of disk space that the user is using. It also has the name of the directory and stuff. So we just cut out that first field so we only get the amount of disk space that user is using. Again, we use the chomp command on that so that our output looks pretty. Okay? Then we do an if statement. In this if statement, we say if usage that we just learned how much disk space that user was using is greater than limit that we set way up at the top here, then print, that user's name, $_0 is over the limit. And then we use that username again, $_0 is using this many kilobytes. How many kilobytes? Usage, which is the amount that came back from that du command. Okay? Once this subroutine's done, it goes right back to the end of this, right back here to this line of code. We increment I again. We go back to the top of the while loop, and we go over and over and over again. Okay? When this while loop is done, we do not come down and execute the subroutine again. Whenever the Perl program sees sub, it doesn't execute that unless it is called explicitly like it is here. Okay, so now I know this might be a little bit fast and a lot of these concepts might have gone over your head a little bit, but I'm trying to show you the big picture structure of Perl programs and some of the key concepts of Perl programs like arrays, subroutines, things like that. Okay, let's move out to the command line here and run this particular Perl script so we can see what the output is like. And then what I want to do is just wrap up this nugget by showing you some resources and where you can learn more about Perl. Okay, so if we run this particular script, we're going to say /spacecheck.pl, and it's going to say Perry is over the limit. Perry is using 9,376 kilobytes. Oh, but notice it can't run on the other users because I'm running this script as Perry. So let me switch over to be the root user. Okay, type in the root user's password, and then run the space check script. Okay, it just says Perry's over the limit. Perry's using 9,376 kilobytes. Okay, let's go back into this script and change this, and let's be a really militant system administrator and not give anybody more than like 5 kilobytes of space. Okay, so then we're going to save this. Okay, we're going to go back out here, again, running as root. We're going to say spacecheck.pl, and now it's going to say Perry's over the limit. He's using this much. Annie's over the limit. Charles is over the limit. Dennis is over the limit. And here's how much space they're using. Okay, so this script is nice because the things that are sort of variables, like this limit is a variable. If I want to change that and be more relaxed because I just got this large disk and now I'm letting people have more disk space, all I have to do is change one variable and the whole operation of the program changes. Okay, so that's the point of this Perl script. Okay, it accomplished what we wanted. It said which normal users in the system are using more than the limit that we set inside of the script. Okay. Now let's pull up a Conqueror web browser, and I just want to show you a web page where you can learn more about Perl, and it's a very nice tutorial. So I've bookmarked it here. And notice it's at www.comp.leads.ac.uk/perl/start.html. Okay, Perl, the P is capitalized there. Okay, and this is a tutorial. Here's like sort of the structure of the tutorial: basic Perl program, scalar variables, array variables. Okay, so we sort of talked about those two things. We didn't talk anything about file handling or control structures. We talked a little bit about conditionals in the sense of the if statements. That's what a conditional is. We talked a little bit about conditionals back in the Bash shell scripting videos, and so you can apply some of that knowledge here. We already learned about while loops, so some of that stuff we've already done. Subroutines, we talked a little bit about subroutines there quickly at the end, and you can see all the other stuff that we haven't even touched on. Okay, and besides all of this is just really an introduction to Perl. Then there's all the business about learning all those modules that I was talking about at the beginning of this nugget. And those modules that you can use, you can plug into a Perl program and give it a whole bunch of extra, functionality. Basically, when you plug in a module, you're plugging in a whole bunch of subroutines that somebody else already wrote to do complicated stuff, like open a socket or send an email message or something like that. Okay, and you can plug in those modules into a Perl script and make it really powerful, and you can make very complicated Perl scripts. Okay, so this is a good resource. I think this is the best Perl tutorial that I've seen on the internet, and that's why I'm pointing you to it if you want to learn more about Perl. All right, well, it's time to wrap up our nugget on the Perl programming language. And we started by talking about Perl and what it's good for. We talked about the structure of a Perl program, how it starts with the shebang / user bin Perl. Then we talked about scalar variables. Okay, these are sort of the most basic variables in Perl. And the scalar variables hold either numbers or strings. Okay, and we saw how Perl could convert strings to numbers if it needed to do arithmetic. So it was very smart about being able to convert between these two data types. Then we talked about if statements and while loops, and we saw that they were basically the same as what we learned back in the Bash shell scripting nugget. Okay, the syntax in Perl is a little bit different than it is in the shell scripting language, but the idea, the concept of what an if statement and a while loop is identical. Okay, then we talked about those array variables. And in our example programs, those array variables, one of them was called names. And we signified that it was an array variable by using that @ sign in front when we assigned values to it. Okay, and remember that these arrays held a whole bunch of elements, like a collection of elements, and we referred to those individual elements by the index in the array. And the first index, the first element in the array is always indexed by number 0, the next one by number 1, the next one by number 2, and so on. And finally, we talked briefly about subroutines. Subroutines is a very complicated idea in programming languages in general, and I just introduced them briefly, showed you how to call a subroutine, and also showed you a very simple one that I wrote. Okay, and the idea here is where you're really probably going to use subroutines more in your Perl programming experience is calling subroutines that other people have written to accomplish tasks, especially if you start including the various modules and stuff that come with Perl. Well, I hope you found this nugget informative, and thanks for watching.